We are at 7:02. We're going to get started because this is a big one. And just right off the bat, if you can't stay the whole time or your brain is completely full, um, you know, feel free to dip out. I will be in no way offended. This is in part why we record these sessions because, you can always go back and review it at your own time. It is going to run about 2 hours, so I am going to be talking fairly quickly, but we're going to do a pretty thorough review of all of the species that we have covered in MarshWatch. We're not going to be covering every single ID feature of them, and we're going to be focusing on what ID features are you most likely to use when identifying it. So we're not going to cover some of the sounds of the species that either make really generic noises like the mallard quack or birds that you don't really hear very often. We're just going to be focusing on the visuals for those. And likewise, for birds that you're not likely to actually see, we're going to be focusing on the audio cues used. So without further ado, let's get going on MarshWatch 9, the bird and amphibian big review. Before we really get started, I just wanted to say that I am broadcasting today from Saskatoon. We're located on Treaty 6 territory, which encompasses the traditional homelands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis people, and it's a place I am very fortunate to call home myself. My name's Leanne. As you've all gathered by now, I love wetlands. I love marsh birds. My day job, I do get to do this sort of thing for work, and this is my job, doing outreach and education stuff. So Birds Canada is a not-for-profit, and we have a mission to drive action to increase understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada. And we really hope that through programming like this, that we hit a few of those nails and inspire people to just love some of those messier habitats on the landscape that really do, provide really excellent source of life on the prairies. So they're fortunate places to be able, we're in a fortunate place here on the prairies to be able to see so many wetlands. Sometimes you don't really know how good you've got it until you're somewhere else. And, if you go back east, you'll wonder where all the ducks are if you're used to what we've got on the prairies. So it's a really wonderful place, especially to learn about marsh birds. Okay. What's on the menu for this evening? I'm actually going to go over the agenda for next week's final webinar pretty quickly, and then we're going to review all of the species covered, and that's all of the amphibians and birds. We'll do plants in the next one. There's not going to be a Zoom quiz at the end of this, and we'll have a bit of a discussion, but we'll try to keep it short just because it will be a pretty long webinar. This usually runs almost 2 hours, so buckle in, and if you need to run out, that is totally okie dokie with me. Okay, so next week we're just going to do a brief recap of why wetlands are important places on the landscape, not just for the birds and amphibians that we've been talking about, but for greater landscape connectivity and what kind of ecosystem goods and services that wetlands provide. We'll also be covering some soundscapes. We're going to review the plants, and then I'll just let you know the MarshWatch stats for this year and how that's compared to years past, because the program has continued to grow and we've expanded to new regions this year. So it's just really cool to see, where we started with MarshWatch and where it's going. And a lot of it is because of you folks. And, I'm sure a lot of you have told other people about the program because I've seen that in some of the registrations saying, oh, my friend sent me this. So we'll talk a little bit about, how MarshWatch has grown over the last couple of years. And then I will get to talking about some of those guided walks and some of the locations. And then afterwards, we'll have quizzes and discussion time for that one. Okay. We covered a whole lot of birds this series. I'm pretty sure I captured every single species on there. So we did 51 bird species, and it doesn't always feel like it because we cover them, I think, in somewhat manageable chunks. But when you go back and you look at it and you go, holy smokes, that is a lot of species that we covered. And hopefully we've given you enough interesting tidbits about most of these species that something kind of anchors you to it, whether that's just learning about how they feed. And if you think that sort of thing is neat, it always helps, I find, to have a bit more of that well-rounded vision of what the bird is. We're not going to be covering that in this one, just the ID features, but I'm amazed at the number of species that we continually manage to cover. And we did not too bad on the amphibians. We did 10 frogs and toads, and we have, a fair number of them here on the prairies. So we're pretty spoiled in terms of amphibians and waterfowl and water birds. Okay, so you will see on a bunch of these slides, I have added little eyeballs and little ears, and that's to indicate how you're most likely going to encounter or identify this species. So some of them, like the Canada goose, you are very likely to see these. They're pretty easy to tell just by looking at them, and they also have a really distinct honking call that I'm pretty sure every Canadian is very familiar with. It is that harbinger of spring when you see those geese and you hear them honking as they're flying over. So this is a good example of what some of the slides will look like. Some of them will just be the little ear symbol and we'll mostly just be talking about the calls, or some of them will be just the little eyeballs, but that's kind of a visual clue as to what you should focus on for identifying that particular species. So the Canada goose is a very large goose. They have that gorgeous white chin strap on a black head and a black neck, and they have a great big brownish body. So pretty iconic, pretty easy to spot, easy to hear. And in case you forgot what they sounded like, here's some honking. So, very familiar, I'm pretty sure, to most of us. Next up, we are going to cover the ducks, and there are an awful lot of ducks, and luckily we have some easy ways to split them into two groupings. We have your dabbling ducks and your diving ducks. Your dabblers feed at the water surface, or they tip up, they put their little bums up in the air, and they try to reach down and grab whatever they can with their bill. They're not typically diving and swimming underwater to get their food. Divers, as the name suggests, are waterfowl that have diving as part of their food seeking strategy. They have their legs fairly far back on their body, and this makes them really awkward on land for the most part. Some of them do okay at walking, but a lot of them really can't walk very far. And divers have relatively thin wings compared to their body size, which means they need a runway to get flying. So they need to flap their wings and run with their little legs on the water's surface to get airborne. So if you have a diver, it's not going to have that get up and go power that, say, a mallard has or any of the other dabbling ducks. The dabblers are the ones that if you've ever walked in a field in spring and you've flushed a hen off of a nest, she explodes right up in the air and is able to get that vertical lift because she's got bigger wings. Divers are just physically incapable of doing that. They do need that little runway. So that's kind of the behavior clues between dabblers and divers. So divers, if you're watching a group of them, they'll just be disappearing and reappearing. It actually makes them really tough to count, especially ones that feed very actively, like bufflehead. They're just always going under the water and coming back up, and it's really tough to, where is it going to come up next? Oh, I didn't realize there was, a couple of hens out there with them. So there's that kind of behavior clue that can just like separate them into two distinct groups. And if you're looking in your field guide, they are organized that way. The dabblers come first and then they cover the divers. So it's an easy behavior clue to separate out the ducks, because the ducks can be a little bit challenging. And here's just a photo of canvasback using that little runway takeoff thing where they're spinning their little legs and they're flapping their wings vigorously to get enough lift. Something that's really useful, especially on dabbling ducks, is taking a look at the wing pattern. And this can be really, really helpful for the hens, who are going to be all different shades of mottled brown. So we call this patch here, these are the secondary feathers. And on waterfowl, we call this the speculum, or the speculum patch. And some species, like the blue-winged teal here, also have another splash of color on that little forewing patch here. So if you've got some brown hens and they happen to take off and fly, or one of them stretches its wing out, make note of that color pattern. Even if you don't memorize which color pattern goes with which species, it's really helpful to know some of those places to look. And on dabbling ducks, if you get a shot or get a look at that wing, it can be really, really helpful for narrowing it down to species. So that's just something to keep an eye out on. Another thing that's really useful for most species in general, but definitely waterfowl, is looking at where the white is on a duck. White is going to reflect all of the visible light spectrum back to your eyeball, and it stands out at a distance. Subtle differences in colors, even iridescent coloring, like this mallard's nice greenish head. If the lighting is off and the light waves aren't bouncing at your eyeball at that perfect angle to see that iridescence, that green is going to look black. And if you've ever looked at waterfowl far away, it can be really, really tough to see any sort of color on them. The color just fades out. What stands out still is bright white or even jet black, as we'll see with the gadwall. The black bum of the gadwall drake stands out just as much as the white does on some of the other waterfowl. So those are a few things to keep in mind if you're taking a look at any sort of ducks on any body of water, or even if they're flying. Okay, let's start off with two large common dabbling ducks. We've got the mallard and the northern shoveler. They both have iridescent green heads, and iridescence isn't a physical coloration, it's a structural coloration, which means the light needs to come from the sun, hit the bird's feathers, and then reflect back to your eyeball at a certain angle, and you will perceive it as being that green color. And you can kind of get a bit of a greenish hue most of the time. They can turn a little bit blue depending on the surroundings and what color the light is. You know, those like really lovely early mornings or evenings they call the golden hour, where the light is just very, very warm and orange. That throws off color perception or the way, you know, a bird appears. So just keep that in mind. Anytime you see those shiny feathers, if the bird is at a, you know, not the perfect angle for your eyeball, that head is going to look fairly dark. So the mallard is a pretty iconic dabbling duck. Bright yellow bill, little white collar, that shiny green head, chestnut front here, and the rear end black with these little drake curls and a little bit of white on that tail feather. The northern shoveler has a gigantic shoehorn bill stuck to its face. It really looks comical. If you ever get to have a good look at a northern shoveler face, it looks silly. It really does look like somebody took a shoehorn and just attached it to that duck's face. So the bill structure is useful. The thing that I key in on most is that white side with the chestnut splotch in the middle of it. Depending on how they're holding the feather, you can see a little bit more white over top of it, but white sides with rusty patch on the flank. That's what my brain uses. I'm scanning and my brain is just cataloging. Yep, white side, rusty patch in the middle. You've got yourself a northern shoveler. There's nothing else that's going to have quite that color pattern to it. They're also useful to learn the calls of because they're one of the more chatty ducks, especially in flight, and they make a suk suk kind of call. So that is the northern shoveler and the mallard. We'll cover their hens together as a group later on. In flight, the speculum for the mallard is blue with a border of black and white. The northern shoveler in flight is actually related to the teal, so the blue-winged teal. It has a very similar kind of powdery blue forewing patch with a little wedge of white, and that speculum patch is kind of greenish. So they even look ridiculous in flight. That bill is just huge and honking as you compare it to, you know, the more typical duck silhouette of the mallard in flight. So those are your two big dabbling ducks with green heads in flight. Two other relatively large dabbling ducks are the gadwall and the northern pintail. I was alluding to the gadwall earlier in that it doesn't necessarily, when you're seeing the bird on the water, have any white that's striking. The thing that really stands out about this duck is it's brown, grayish overall, and has such a huge patch of black on its rear end. That is the thing that I always clue in on, much like the northern shoveler. If I'm scanning, it's like, yep, jet black bum, jet black bum, jet black bum, and it's easy to pick up on. It's kind of the opposite of the white in that, you know, it's just kind of a dark jet black hole, and it doesn't reflect anything, and that kind of stands out in its own way as well, especially because it's a really big patch on an otherwise kind of grayish, brownish duck. If you get a look at the bill, it's mostly dark with orange along the sides of it. So you're not going to see that orange on the top, but you'll have orange kind of getting a bit like around the lips, so maybe it's got some exaggerated lipstick on it. This is another very chatty duck, and they make a bep 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 call. If you're familiar at all with Sesame Street and the aliens called Yip Yips, it always reminds me of Yip Yips, and this is one of the songs that always brings me joy. So that's one that they do call a lot in flight. And sometimes I'll be sitting there at a pond looking at stuff and I'll just hear bep, 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 bep coming like from behind me somewhere. So it is a little bit useful in terms of a call because they do tend to be a chattier duck and it's relatively loud. The northern pintail has a very quiet call that I feel like you're usually feeling pretty lucky if you wind up hearing it. The northern pintail is a swan-like duck. This is the most elegant duck that we have in terms of nice long neck, slender proportions. As the name suggests, the drake has this really nice long pintail at the back. The white really stands out, so kind of at the halfway down the neck, and there's a spur of white that goes up the side of the neck. Really, really stands out. There's nothing that has quite that long, elegant neck with that white spur coming up and around the side. Very plain chestnut face, but long pintail, swan-like, and again, that white neck just really, really stands out at a distance, and that's what I focus on when I'm looking at a group of waterfowl. It's like, ooh, you key in on that white neck with that long spur, and then if you're lucky, you get to see, ooh, yes, it does have its nice tail, and it is holding it in a way that I can see it a little better. They're just a super, super elegant duck. Their bills are kind of neat. They look kind of like those old-timey, not quite white wall tires, but for whatever reason, it kind of reminds me of that. So dark overall with kind of bluish on the sides, sort of like the Gadwall, but it's got like black lip liner on, and then it's a bit of blue lipstick maybe. So those are the Gadwall and the Northern Pintail. Those are the two still relatively large ducks. In flight, the Gadwall, what really stands out is it looks like a little square of white. There's black bordering it, and if you get it in the right light, you can see this rusty forewing patch. But really what stands out is that kind of white square in the wing as they're flying away. And it really does look like a little square or a little rectangle, and that just because it's so bright white, it really catches the light and it stands out, especially when they're flying. The northern pintail's wing is maybe a little bit more subtle, so there's kind of iridescent green in the middle with a white bottom border and a buffy kind of a straw colored stripe at the top of it. It's still a very elegant looking duck in flight. You can really make out that long neck and that tail just kind of goes to a point. If you're familiar with what lawn darts are before they were, banned for causing injury, northern pintails sort of have a lawn dart look to them with the head. They tend to fly with their neck out fairly straight. This one's kind of coming in for a landing, so it looks a little bit awkward, but they have that nice long profile and that kind of pintail sticking out the back. So that is the Gadwall and Northern Pintail. Next, we have some smaller dabbling ducks. The green-winged teal is our smallest, followed by the blue-winged teal, and the American widgeon is a little bit bigger than both of those. So they're all fairly small, and again, looking at where the white is really going to be key. On this blue-winged teal, they have a really, really large crescent that kind of takes up that entire part of the face between the eye and the bill. It's just a massive crescent. They also have a black and white rear end, but really that really, really large crescent on an otherwise darkish looking face really makes it stand out at a fair distance. Similarly, the green-winged teal has a lot of really beautiful, rich colors going on. But if the lighting is a little bit off, it's amazing how similar that kind of iridescent green and that chestnut can just blend into one another, and it just kind of looks dark at a distance. But that white little spur on a gray background here is really, really helpful for IDing green-winged teals. You'll just see these tiny little spurs on the kind of front third of their sides there. On the back end, they have a bit of a triangle of white-ish. There's a little bit of straw colored to it, bordered in black. And that's a little bit more helpful for the hen, which we'll see in a second, who has a little bit of a white patch on the rear end. So blue-winged teal, that white crescent in front of the face. Green-winged teal, really focusing here on that white spur. And the American widgeon, the thing that always catches my eye first with the widgeon, if they're reasonably close, is this kind of dusty pinkish side to the body. There isn't another duck that has that really, or at least not here, has that really warm kind of dusty pink tones to it. They have a white forehead. Both the green-winged teal and the American widgeon have a dramatic green eyeshadow, but again, that's not always the easiest to tell. The white really stands out at a distance. Some of the drakes have more of a white patch on their forehead than others do, but usually you will still see some amount of white. They have a stubby, tiny little bill that is pale bluish and edged in black. And their rump is again black and white, very similar to the blue-winged teal's rear end. But even if you don't memorize that sort of thing, and honestly, I don't think I have all of the rear ends memorized, but just knowing it's like, okay, black followed by white, that will help you then go to your resource material. Half of what, knowing how to identify a bird or get to an ID is knowing the types of things for different groups that are important for identification and what are the things to key in on. So waterfowl, a lot of the white is what you're going to be doing, especially the divers. If you can see anything on the wing, that is also really helpful. So American widgeon, handsome little birds. All of these do make noises, but we don't hear a ton of them, and they don't always travel super far. So you're mostly going to be using visual ID. So focus on where the white is, and that will help lead you to a clear ID. In flight, they all have some variation of a greenish, darkish speculum, and the borders of them are different. So that blue-winged teal, just like its name says, has a nice blue wing here on its kind of forewing patch. So that really stands out. And that's similar to the northern shoveler, but they look very different overall. But in flight, that blue-winged teal, green speculum, great big powdery blue forewing patch with a little bit of a white wedge. The green-winged teal kind of has a black and green speculum, kind of the part that's closest to the duck's body is greenish, and further out to the wing, it gets kind of darkish, and it's bordered with a little bit of buffy, so that's just that straw colored. And American widgeon, similar as well, green and black on the speculum, but they have a white forewing patch. So if you get a bead on some of those wings, you can start to narrow down your options. Okay, now we're going to talk about hens, and I deliberately didn't put any species names on this slide, and that's just to drive home the idea that, especially with the hens, you can separate them into dabblers and divers just looking at the patterning on their feathers, especially the pattern on their body feathers. So up top here, these are our dabbling ducks, and they're relying on being camouflaged in a grassy environment. They're not wanting to, get seen by anything while they're on their nests. Dabbling ducks, they nest in upland habitat, so grassy areas, and they're camouflaged to blend into that background. The diving ducks, on the other hand, which are down here, they don't have that complex patterning on the body feathers. They're more uniform in coloration. They tend to be a little bit darker. Again, they're not trying to blend in with dead grass in a field. They're trying to look like either the inside of a tree cavity, or they're trying to blend in with the water of the wetland, because a lot of them will make a nest in the wetland vegetation, but near the water, or sometimes entirely just over the water. So they're relying on looking much more like that kind of dark or watery background. So that's just a useful clue. So even if all you do, the hens are tough. They're not easy. And if you can separate them into dabblers and divers, you have already, made such a large distinction between the two groups that you've narrowed it down a ton. And if all you're getting is dabbling and diving for the first while, you're doing great. The hens, the females of the waterfowl are very tricky. They look very similar to one another. The key with them is if you're trying to learn them, you feel like you've got a handle on the drakes, and that's usually where I tell people to start. In the springtime, a lot of waterfowl either are arriving on the breeding grounds already paired up, or they're looking to get paired up. And so you'll often see males and females of the same species hanging out together. And that's convenient because you can start to learn a bit more of the shape of the duck. And you go, okay, yes, both of those are fairly similarly proportioned. Like, yes, this northern pintail hen really does have a kind of nice swan look to her, just like the drake has. So don't worry if the female ducks are challenging. They're challenging because they are difficult. So just going to preface that with it. So I don't want anybody to get discouraged because it is very, very tricky. Okay. Let's start breaking it down. One of the ways that I've always found helpful for the hens is if you don't have a look at the wing, take a look at the bill first, and that usually narrows it down to a grouping. So these are dabbling hens, and they all happen to be on the large size, but these guys all have orange in some amount on their bills. The mallard on the far left side over here has a very bright orange bill that either has a patch over the kind of the center of the bill that's either, black and a very thick splotch, or sometimes they'll have more a spotted look to them. It won't be a continuous patch of black on the bill, but that's a key thing to look for here. So taking a look at the bill here, got that kind of splotchy. We move over to the gadwall. She has a very similar bill to the drake, and it's kind of, you can think of it as a dark bill with orange running down the sides of it. So if you were to look from above, the center of it would look fairly dark, but you can see that it goes to bright orange right along the edge of the bill. The northern shoveler hen, she has the same kind of shoehorn bill that the drake has. And once you've seen a few of them in person, you'll be like, oh, okay, I see it now. That thing does look ridiculous on the bird's face. It is very, very large in proportion to the rest of the bird. So that really helps to, make it stand out from the crowd. But otherwise, it's kind of got this orangey look to it with kind of olive greenish in the middle, but very much edged in that kind of orangey look. And there's an orange undertone to the whole thing, but that shape is really super useful for kind of identifying a northern shoveler, whether it's a drake or a hen. They all have that same massive bill. If you do get a chance to take a peek at the speculum patch on the wings, that is another key thing to identify them. But they're not always cooperative. Oftentimes, if they're sitting on the water, they have their wings tucked up. Every once in a while, they'll do something convenient like this mallard hen here, where the way she's holding her feathers, you can see that speculum patch that's similar to the drakes with blue in the middle, bordered with black and white. Guess I didn't write black on the bottom of that slide. I'll have to fix it. And the gadwall, the hen, she also has that kind of square white patch on the wing, and you can just see a little bit of it poking out here, and that can be a pretty helpful hint. Another thing you want to do is looking at what's going on the face, and sometimes contrasting that to the coloration of the rest of the body. The mallard hen, she tends to have a bit of a nice dark eye line through the eye, and usually the head patterning and coloration is a bit more pale than, say, what's going on the rest of the body. So a little bit lighter and richer coloring on the body. So it does almost have a two-tone effect. But if you're not seeing that and you're not picking it up, don't worry about it. The gadwall hen, she also has a little bit of an eyeline. It's a little bit more faint, and she also has a slightly kind of cooler toned brown head than the rest of her body. But again, we're getting into, the subtleties here. And the northern shoveler, she has a little bit of an eye line going on as well, but she's a good example of not much contrast between the coloration of the head and the coloration of the body. They're all kind of the same kind of brownish tones. Just zooming in a little bit closer so we can get those bills here. So the gadwall, dark with orange along the side, and the mallard hen more kind of brightly orange with some sort of dark patch or splotches or speckles on top of the bill. So very handsome little hens, and trust me, it took me a long time to start to feel comfortable and confident identifying female waterfowl. And sometimes, if they're too far away, I can't tell. I know it's a large dabbling duck, and sometimes that's the best you can do with the look that you have. Sometimes they're just too far away, the lighting sucks. Just know that not every single bird you lay your eyes on can actually be identified. It's not always possible. Okay. Two other hens, we've got the northern pintail and the American widgeon. And I deliberately chose this photo of the northern pintail because she has her neck scrunched up just a little bit. She can look very much like the drake and hold that neck up nice and slender and high, but sometimes they do have that neck scrunched up. And the thing with the northern pintails, you're going to look at it and go, okay, that has a dark bill and it is very brown, very plain. Take a look at the face, and the face is usually quite plain. There isn't much of any sort of eyeline going on, really nothing to speak about, but the face usually winds up being a warmer tone of brown than the rest of the body. And you can see that here on the neck. On the neck, it's kind of more of a gray brown, and up here, it's more of a brown if you want to call it that, more in the red tones. And I realize if you happen to be colorblind that this isn't going to be helpful at all for you, and you're going to be using slightly different cues, but she's still going to have slender, elegant proportions, a little bit of a long tail, but definitely not as exaggerated as the Drake Northern Pintail. But dark bill, plain face, relatively large dabbling hen. If you do get to see the speculum, which I don't think I've got a good picture of it here, it's bronze with a white border. The American widgeon is one that I find still fairly easy to identify just because she has this kind of dark, smudgy eye thing going on. Kind of just looks like there's some eyeshadow happening where there's a distinct dark smudge that's just more than just a dark little eyeball. Relatively short, stubby bill that has kind of pale blue with an edging in black, and it looks like she dipped the little front of it in an inkwell there. The pattern on the side of the body, it's warmer brown. It's not quite that rosy pinky tone that the drakes have, but it's still kind of a plain brown along the sides. So dark eye smudge, short stubby little bill, and otherwise looks like a dabbling duck. That's going to get you to American widgeon. And she also has a black and green speculum with a white border on top. And you can only just see a little bit of that white border here as she's holding her wing. Okay, what I think is probably the two trickiest of the dabbling hens are the teal. So both of these are quite tiny. And if you see them out in a group of other waterfowl, they're easy to pick out because they are that much smaller than the surrounding birds. So we've got blue-winged teal on top and green-winged teal on the bottom here. Overall, the green-winged teal is going to have a dark face. She's going to have a nice dark eyeline, but it's very dark looking overall. The blue-winged teal has a paler looking face. There's a little bit of pale feathering at the base of the bill, and you can see there's some white around the eye. So she kind of has little white eye arcs. The other thing that it took me years to figure this out, and I don't know why, but the green-winged teal hens, I mentioned that the drakes have this kind of triangle at their rear end of, kind of whitish or straw colored. The hens have something similar as well. So they have this little streak of plain white. And believe it or not, that's actually really useful to identify them because the other hens don't have that. So usually if I'm scanning, I first go to small duck has dark bill. Okie dokie. Then I look at the rear end and see if I can see any white. And then I go to the head and I say, okay, is it kind of just darkish overall? Or is there any pale feathering at the base of the bill and around the eye? So two very similar little ducks. If you're just getting to teal, you're doing amazing because, the teals are hard to separate. They're not easy. But yeah, both of them small little ducks, dark little bills, and they both have some greenish on the speculum, so that's not always a big slam dunk for it if you're just seeing them while they're tootling around on the water. If you do see the hen in flight, she does have a blue wing patch, but as you can see here, you would never know it unless she stretches her wing or takes off or is coming in for a landing. You're not going to see that pale blue patch, which is amazing because it's a fairly large patch, right? So she's just got it tucked up under all of those feathers. And again, all of this coloration is to be camouflaged against a background of grassy material. So hopefully seeing them all together has helped a little bit to solidify them in your brain. And if you still think that hens are confusing, that's totally fine. They're very confusing. They're not easy. Okay, we're going to move along here to the diving ducks. And the canvasback is a very large diving duck. The redhead is a little bit smaller, but they're both largish and have a red head. The thing to clue in on here is first the coloration of the back and the body. The canvasback has a really bright white back and body. You want to think canvas, think, an unpainted canvas, think bright white canvas material on that bird's back. The whole thing just glows at a distance because there is so much white, and it is really it is a very white. It's not like kind of slightly grayish. The redhead, on the other hand, is going to have a similar look, but the back and sides are going to be gray. Otherwise, if you're kind of squinting and you look at a distance, they look a little bit like Oreo cookies. They've got a black rear end, dark black and or reddish front end, and what's sandwiched in the middle is kind of the key for differentiating these two species, if you can also see that red head. The canvasback has a very uniquely shaped head, and it always reminds me, and I like to use this analogy, of a little skier. Maybe this is even, a cross-country skiing slope, but this is the easy green run. If you imagine a little skiing person on the top, your little man is not panicking. Everything's going to be okay. If you're looking at the forehead of the redhead, however, if you put your little skiing person on the top, unless they're used to skiing black diamonds, they might be a little bit terrified going down this slope. So that head shape, if you're confused, you're like, it's got a red head and I'm not sure, the head shape can be really, really useful. At a distance, again, that red and that black kind of merge into one, and that large back of the sides and the back bright white stands out, and likewise the gray just doesn't shine at a distance. You can still see the difference between the gray and the black, but the canvasback, it practically glows. It is so bright white. And taking a look at them side by side here, you can see, imagine your little skiing man on the top, gentle slope down, but if you're putting a little skier on the top of the redhead's forehead, you are just, that is going very, very fast. And again, that bright white canvas back versus the grayish back of the redhead. So note head shape and body color. That can be really useful for telling those two species apart. And speaking of Oreo divers, we have the scaup and the ringneck duck. And these are very black, white, and gray birds. So at first glance, they look really similar, especially lesser scaup and greater scaup. I still have trouble identifying the two, especially on migration when we have a greater chance of seeing greater scaup on the prairies. This is by no means an easy differentiation, and if you take a look at a bird guide, something like Sibley, and it devotes like a whole page to telling these two species apart, it's because they're difficult. So if you get to scaup, you're doing fantastic. But these guys look like Oreo cookies, essentially. So you got dark on the rear end, dark head, dark, chest kind of area, and some sort of lighter tones in the middle. Take a look first at what color the back is. For ringneck duck, the back is totally jet black. And so that, for me, is a thing that I key in on. It's like, okay, Oreo cookie looking duck, what color is the back? and that back just stands right out like a sore thumb because it is jet black. They do have a bit of a whitish spur, but depending on what the lighting is looking at or looking like and how they're holding their feathers, that can be a little bit obscured. It's not something I use. They do have a lovely white ring on their bill. It's also edged in a little bit of white, but that white ring around their bill really stands out. Don't let the name fool you. Ringneck ducks, they do have sort of a ring on their neck, and it's extremely subtle. And it was one of those things where somebody named it because they had been sent a specimen of a duck, and they're like, oh, look at this slightly iridescent purple ring around their neck that nobody is going to see in the field. I've seen it a handful of times, and I've seen a lot of ringneck ducks. So think of it more as a ring-billed duck. That would be, I think, a better name for the species. Okay. Otherwise, we have the lesser and greater scops. So they have that Oreo cookie look, but their back at a distance especially looks very much gray. If you see them up close, it's really kind of variegated, like wavy lines of black and white. But at a distance, which is how we're seeing these ducks, it kind of just reads gray overall. And to differentiate the two scop, you can do it by head shape. And my favorite way is if you get to see their wings. So for the lesser scop, the head peaks a little bit further back. You can sort of see a little bit of a peak here. And the greater scop just has more of a bulbous looking forehead, really has that kind of a big mass on the front end of their head. They do have differences in iridescence, but there's overlap, and seeing iridescence is never perfect. So I don't use what color the iridescence is of their head, in part because I'm usually too far to see that anyway. So I'm relying more on head shape if they're just floating around in the water. So head shape, super useful. But again, it can be tough to see at a distance. And if you're just getting to scop, you're doing pretty darn good. That's just kind of highlighting a bit of that slightly further peaked back of the lesser scop there. My favorite way is if they show you their wings. So either they're taking off, they're landing, or they're stretching. So in greater scop, there is a greater amount of white on the wing. So both of them have white on this kind of speculum area. The lesser scop, it just kind of is restricted to those secondary feathers, that speculum. And the greater scop, that white kind of trails into, not, it doesn't totally reach the wingtip, but that white transitions more throughout the wing here into the primary feathers. So greater scop has greater white in the wing. The lesser scop has lesser white in the wing. This is my preferred way of identifying them, but of course, birds don't always cooperate. And so sometimes I just say, yep, I saw some scop in the distance. Could not tell the difference between the two because, again, sometimes they are just too far away. It can be really handy if you ever get into a situation where you see the two species side by side, and then you can really get a handle on some of those subtleties. But I've seen that a handful of times myself, so it can be really tough. So don't worry about it if you're just getting down to scop. They're tough. Okay. We also have some very small and what I think are absolutely adorable diving ducks. Both the ruddy duck and the bufflehead are very unique looking little ducks. The ruddy duck has this great big white cheek patch and this impossibly electric blue bill, and it is shaped very much like a rubber ducky toy. Big, thick neck, relative to the rest of the size of its body, and they have a stiff tail, which, especially the drakes, they often have sticking up in some amount. So you'll often see this exact silhouette where they're just compact, chubby looking little ducks, and that white cheek patch, really big, and it stands out at, oops, I knocked the little wheel here. It stands out at a distance, as does the shape. And if you're close enough and you see that blue and you really get good light on it, it's just shockingly powder blue. You go, how on earth and why on earth did that develop? I have no idea. It's probably the ladies start saying, ooh, this one's got a nice blue bill. Yes, this will be the father of my children. So usually a lot of those things, it's driven by female choice, but how, why, it's a mystery. On the other hand, the bufflehead is much more black and white overall, and it kind of has like a pie chart look to its head where a big, quarter third of the back of its head is this bright white on otherwise a dark head and a dark upper body and a white lower body. They have a tiny stubby little bill, but that white chunk of the back of the head is so white and it stands out really, really well at a distance, especially because it is bordered with jet black. If you do see them up close and you get to see the iridescence, they have just a rainbow of colors that their feathers produce depending on the light. So if you get them in the right light, their faces can look fairly multicolored. But for the most part, we're seeing these birds at a distance and it just looks black at a distance. So very, very easy to spot with that big white patch on the back of the head, and that's the bufflehead. So two pretty wonderful drakes in terms of waterfowl. Okay, now we're going to take a peek at the diving hens, and just to reinforce that, they have much more plain feathering. You can see all of the variegation, all of the modeling on all of these birds up here. These are all of the dabblers that we covered. They want to blend into that grass. The divers want to blend into dark waters or dark cavities, because some of them do nest in tree cavities. Okay. First up, the easiest one to kind of identify and get out of the way is the canvasback, and that's because of that head bill shape again. Really kind of broad, gentle, sloping forehead to bill transition. Again, if you're putting someone skiing on it, they're not panicking. They're going to do okay. So nice, big, sloped forehead. And again, she's quite a large diving duck, so going to be a fair bit bigger than a number of the other species that she's going to be around, but that really kind of sloped forehead is pretty wonderful for having a shape field mark for it. Otherwise, she's kind of warmish brown, maybe a hint of a pale iring and a hint of a pale throat, but really the thing that stands out is that head shape, which they share in common with the drake of the species. So that is the canvasback. And then we're getting into kind of like more larger brown diving hens that don't have that easy shape characteristic to go by. You're going, my goodness, those are very plain brown birds. Luckily, the ringneck duck hen does have that same white around the bill. So take a look at the bill, and if you see that white ring around it, you're like, yes, good for ringneck duck. That's an easy one to just get out of the way there. The redhead and the lesser scaup, a little bit more challenging. The lesser scaup, they don't always have this much white at the base of their bill, and in fact, during a lot of the breeding season, that white gets fairly reduced. In the wintertime, this can be really bright white and can usually point out like, aha, that is a scaup hen with that kind of bright white base of the bill. During the breeding season, it can be a little tougher because she is doing everything she can to, not draw attention to herself, so she's molted out some of those feathers and just has kind of more of a pale area around the base of the bill. If you take a look at the eye color, these other ducks have dark eyes. So the ringneck duck has a dark eye, redhead has a dark eye. The lesser scaup has a yellowish eye, and I always think they kind of look bedraggled for it. They just look like they're wide-eyed and like stunned, trying to take care of all of these kids. And lesser scaup will also do something called creshing, where a bunch of hens will say, hey, you look like a great babysitter. I'm going to leave my kids with you and I'm going to take off. And so sometimes you'll see scaup hens just like, I feel like looking bedraggled because there's like a ton of little kids behind them. So in the summertime, I'm usually looking a little bit at that eye color. Otherwise, very, very plain brown overall. Not the easiest to tell. The redhead, dark eye, and has a little bit of that paleness around the base of the bill, but otherwise is looking fairly generic. And I think if I had the hardest time, it's trying to figure out like, is that redhead? What is it? Because they just look very, very plain and there's not a ton for your brain to latch onto. Even the ringneck duck, her back is often more darkly colored and distinct from the rest of the body. In the redhead, it's kind of more the same, and so it is tough. So large brown diving hens, dark bills. If you got a ring around it, you got yourself a ring-necked duck. And if you got a pale eye and more paleness around the base of the bill, you got yourself a lesser scaup and a redhead. The greater scaup hen is going to look much the same, again with those same head shape characteristics of the drake. So I don't have any photos of that. They were a little bit harder to source. Okay. Taking a look at those small diving hens, got the ruddy duck and the bufflehead. They are, of course, much more subdued, but the ruddy duck hen, she still looks like a rubber ducky. She still has that kind of great big bill, big head, and she doesn't usually quite have her tail sticking straight up as much as the drake does. You'll often see her with her tail down, but really compact looking duck. They sort of look like a bit of a football. Um, she does have a bit of that white cheek patch, and there's a dark stripe running through it. So kind of whitish cheek patch, similar to the drake, who has that bright white cheek patch, but a little bit of a darker line running through it. And she doesn't have the bright, colorful bill that the drake has. So she's otherwise small, compact, a very warm brown, especially if you're contrasting it to Bufflehead. And in Saskatoon, in Hyde Park, there's a pond where you get reddy ducks, and you'll often see Bufflehead migrating through on it as well. So it's a good contrast in warm browns to very, very kind of dark gray, cool tones overall. So nice, warm for the small reddy duck. The bufflehead hen is small, compact, has that stubby little bill still, and she's got a little bit of a white oval kind of below and behind the eye, but otherwise small and quite dark looking. So those are the two diving hens. Phew, we almost made it through. Okay. Last but not least, we also added in the mergansers, and mergansers are diving ducks that have specialized long bills that are very thin, and they're serrated, and they're very, very good at catching fish and crayfish and those sorts of foods. So we got the common merganser on top and the red-breasted merganser on the bottom there, and the drakes are really quite easy to tell apart. The common merganser, black back and white flank and neck. The head usually looks a little bit greener, but this is a great example of it. You know, you can sometimes get a bit of that green iridescence, like here on the red breast. You can just sort of see it, but again, as with all iridescence, it always depends on how the light is reaching you. So very, very black and white with that long red sawtooth bill. And both of these have that kind of long red sawtoothed bill. The red-breasted merganser has a bright white collar and kind of a rusty breast with dark streaks on it. It has a red eye, which again adds to it looking somewhat bedraggled, along with its shaggy crest. It doesn't have a nice, beautiful, well put together looking crest. It has a lot of little wispies hanging off of it. So the drakes are fairly easy to tell apart. Red breast has that kind of reddish on the breast, but that white collar stands out at a distance. And the common merganser drake, very, very large, black and white diving duck with that sawtoothed red bill. I'll take a look at the hens because this is where it gets complicated, of course. So the two hens look really similar. They have grayish bodies and they kind of have rusty reddish heads. The things we're going to be focusing in on to tell the mergansers apart is that transition between that head color and the neck color. The commons have contrast, so there's a distinct line between that reddish on the head and kind of grayish and whitish on the throat. It's a well-defined, solid line. It's high contrast as you're going from one to the other. The red-breasted blends, so that kind of rusty reddish head blends into the kind of more grayish and pale tones on the throat. So you're not seeing that kind of sharp contrast that the hen has. That the common hen has. So the common merganser hen also has a distinct white chin patch, and again, it's very high contrast. There's nice, clean, sharp lines between them, so it's a very distinct little patch. The red-breasted merganser hen, There's a little bit of paleness kind of around the bottom of the bill here, but it doesn't have that distinct look of like, yes, there's definitely a different patch of color here. So commons have contrast and redbreast blends. That's the best tips that I can give you. They're challenging to separate apart, and it takes practice and it takes seeing a few of both of them. Because once you see the common, you're like, oh, I totally see that contrast line between the head and the neck color. Whereas if you've only seen a bunch of red-breasted mergansers, you're just sitting there, you know, trying to invent some contrast. If you're trying to invent the contrast, it's probably not there. It's probably a good tip. So if you're taking a look at it and you're going like, oh gosh, is it distinct? If you're wondering, it's not distinct. The common really does have a very clean, neat line around the neck there. So that's the large merganser hens. And we also have a smaller merganser, the hooded merganser, and they look quite a fair bit different than the other mergansers. They still have a bit of a sawtooth bill, but it's not, super long. It's not wildly colored. The drakes are they're pretty flashy little guys, and the biggest prominent feature is that large white crest that's bordered and edged in black on a black head. And because this is a crest where, they're using it to signal, I've just shown here for illustrative purposes, depending on how he's holding his head feathers, that crest can take on a few different appearances, but it'll always be white completely surrounded by that black, and it's different than the bufflehead. The bufflehead wouldn't have this kind of dark edging to the back of the head. Otherwise, we'd be talking about, comparing the two species, but they're different enough with that dark ridge along the back of the crest. And again, they have a sawtoothed, fine, pointy little bill. The hens are fairly nondescript in that kind of cool gray tones, and there's a bit more of a rusty reddish tones to her little crest that kind of fades. So it goes from like reddish to white on the outer parts, and her bill is yellow with a bit of dark on the top. So those are the hooded mergansers. They're small, compact little diving ducks with that kind of sawtooth bill, and they are absolutely adorable, especially if you see a bunch of the hooded merganser drakes displaying to one another, trying to, win the favor of the females. They look all kinds of ridiculous. They throw their heads back with their crest all going, and it's just I highly recommend if you happen to be in an area where you're seeing them. They nest in tree cavities, so you'll often see them in places that have a bit more wooded vegetation and ponds nearby because they do walk obviously from they're walking their kids as the kids take that leap of faith out from a nesting cavity. I don't think I've covered this before, but all of the ducks and waterfowl that either nest on cliffs or in cavities, they're young. They just leap out, and they are young and bouncy enough that they just hit the ground, they bounce up, and they keep going. Yeah, much much like human babies are way more flexible than, say we get to be as we're getting older. Similar thing for the waterfowl, that they just got to take that leap of faith. And I guess if one lands square on its head, it doesn't get into the breeding population. Okay, next up we have the grebes. And grebes are similar to a lot of the diving waterfowl that we covered, but they are in a different group. They are not ducks. So grebes are more closely related to loons, and they are expert divers. These guys spend so much time under the water, and they can remain submerged for a good amount of time. They tend to have pointed bills, and some of those are long, some of those are a little bit more compact, like the pie-billed grebe here, but they have kind of a pointy bill to them, and they have practically no tail feathers. It looks more like just a fluffy rear end if you get to take a look at it. The redneck grebe is a large grebe, and it has a silvery cheek patch. While it's not bright white, it still reflects enough light to really stand out at a distance. And so these guys have kind of a large blob of a body, a long neck, longish bill, and that kind of bright white cheek patch. They do stand out quite a fair bit at a distance because of that silvery cheek patch. They do have a red neck, as their name suggests, but this kind of reddish tone along with this dark tone here. If the lighting is not good or you're looking at them and it's a fair distance away, it's just all going to look very similar. It's all going to look just kind of gray-ish looking. So while it can be helpful if you're seeing them up close, really what I want you to focus in on is that great big white cheek patch on something that just kind of resembles more of a loon than a duck. And they are very, very loud, and they have a loud call that travels a great distance. And you'll often find redneck grebes on larger wetlands or edges of lakes that have marshy areas to the side of them, and that water really helps the call travel a long way. So let's listen to the whinnying, braying of the redneck grebe. So if you're thinking like, gosh, that sounds sort of loony, but it sounds ridiculous, likely a redneck grebe. They kind of have much more of a braying quality to it, kind of like ah, ha, 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 like they're laughing to themselves about something. Um, the pinebill grebe is quite a bit different. You do get to see these guys every now and again, but they are very shy. They don't like people. And they will submerge themselves very slowly and they'll watch you. They'll keep their eyes on you and then they'll swim underwater to the other side of the wetland and then they'll do that kind of they'll come out of the water and they'll be looking to see if you're still there, and if you're still there they're going to be like no, going back underwater. So they're pretty sneaky little guys, but every once in a while you get a nice good look at them. Overall, this is a dark bird which has a bright whitish bill that has a dark ring around the tip, and that's where it gets its name, pied bill. Pied is multicolored, so they have that nice white bill and it connects to some fleshy tissue around their eyes. So they kind of have like built-in spectacles that go along with their bill. And again, that kind of dark ring around it. They do have a dark patch on their throat. So if you do get to see them, they're handsome little birds if you get your eyes on them and they're close enough. I've only ever really had one that was just calling and it was pretty comfortable. It was in Saskatoon at Hyde Park, and we all got really, really good looks at it because for whatever reason, I guess it was just comfortable enough with people that it was like, whatever, I'm just going to be calling out in the open. They also have a very loud call that can be heard, sometimes half a mile away on a wetland, way off in the distance. It's just a lower toned call that really travels very well. So they have two calls. The owl hoop call is the one that travels a long distance and the one you're most likely to hear just because it's very, very loud. And that kind of end of the call, they can either keep it short, or like the one we just heard, they can kind of drag it out and just keep whoop, 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 whoop. So it all depends on factors that I don't understand for how the bird is going to be calling. So just know that it can be short or it can be a bit longish, but it all has that kind of ow whooping quality to it. A neat little call that they will do in a pair. So one will start doing it, and the pair, when they're nearby, or the other, mate, they will do this kind of laughing hyena call together. I'll play it again because it was a very short track. That one does not travel a great distance away, so you're not going to be hearing it from half a mile over. Just usually done, within the pair, one will start and the other one often joins in, but sometimes you get it just doing them on its own. So the ow hoop call that you can hear at a long distance, ow, 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 whoop, ow, whoop, ow, whoop, and that laughing hyena. Okay. Next, we have the horned grebe and the eared grebe. These two are quite similar in size and they have a fairly distinct shape difference. They do both have kind of this rusty and black coloration on different parts of them. But as I mentioned earlier, those two tones, if you get the lighting not so great, they just blend into one another. And I almost never am looking at like, is there red on the neck of the horned grebe? Instead, what I'm doing is I've got this general small grebe shape. Um, Again, with that little fluffy bum, doesn't look like it has a tail. These guys tend to have a short, pointy little bill, and the head shapes are distinct between the two species. Eared grebe really looks like it has a triangular, pointy head, especially at a little bit of a distance. So if you want to like squint your eyes at the screen here and see that kind of pointy shape of the eared grebe, it really is the thing that I use almost exclusively to look at eared grebes. I just see tiny little grebes out there and it's like, oh, little pointy heads, little triangle heads. They're pretty distinct in that way. The horned grebe has much more of a flat-topped head. They can have these like lovely cheek feathers fluffed out and they can raise that their kind of eyebrows a little bit, but overall they don't give very like triangular pointy head. They have more of a flat top head going on. They both have kind of these yellow plumes behind the eyes. On the eared grebes, they're very wispy and they don't form a solid mass really like they do on the horned grebe. The horned grebe really has a solid patch between the eye going to the back of the head. The eared grebe, sometimes the way the feathers are, because they're all wet, they're diving, they can sometimes clump a little bit together, but that overall very pointy little head is useful. And this one is useful to know behaviorally what they do. Outside of migration, I actually saw, a group of horned grebes a couple of weeks ago by Chaplin Lake. On the breeding grounds, horned grebes are found in pairs, usually on small ponds, and usually in ponds where you don't have a piebilled grebe. They don't seem to overlap very much, if at all, with piebilled grebes. I think the piebilled grebes are probably a little bit more dominant, and the horned grebes are kind of relegated to smaller ponds. So you'll often see horned grebes in the breeding season in pairs on small ponds. The eared grebes are the opposite. Eared grebes nest in colonies, and so you don't usually see just one or two eared grebes. Usually you're seeing a dozen, 20 of them, 50. I had one point count that I did one morning where I had 52 eared grebes, which was a lot to keep track of. So you'll often see eared grebes in larger groups, especially during the breeding season. So that behaviorally can be a little bit of a clue as well. We do have two very similar grebes next. We got the Western grebe and the Clark's grebe. These are black and white with long pointed bills. So they're kind of like a mix between a swan and a loon. They have that kind of very sleek looking body overall, but they have very, very long neck and they do tend to hold their necks up a fair bit and a long pointy bill that's kind of yellowish in color. Western grebe is by far the most widespread, abundant of these two grebes. Usually you're on a mission to try to find yourself a Clark's grebe if you've never seen one before. So more often than not, when you're seeing these grebes, you're going to be seeing the Western grebe. And there are hybrids between the two, and the lines can get blurred, but by and large, most of what you're going to be seeing is the Western grebe. And to tell the difference between the two, you're going to be looking right up around the face. In the Western grebe, that eye is encapsulated with that dark feathers. The dark feathers come down off of the top of the head and they circle in the eye. The Clark's grebe, I like to think of it as you can see the eye a little bit better because there is no dark that comes down around the eye. Instead, it's still that white feathering around the eye, and it just makes the eye stand out a little bit more at a distance. The bill color is also different between the two, but that's one of those things that if they're far away, that could be tough to tell. I've seen one Clark's grebe in all of my birding life, and it was up fairly close, but it did look like this. It did have have a kind of bright yellow bill, and I could clearly see the eye. There was no dark feathering around it. The Western grebe, overall, the bill is much more dull yellow and it's edged in black. So those are the two very elegant, very swan-like grebes. Western grebe, far more common than the Clark's grebe is going to be. Um, they do nest in colonies, so usually, again, if you're seeing one Western grebe, you're seeing lots of Western grebes. And if you can get out to where they're nesting, the Quill Lakes in Saskatchewan is a great place to go see them. At least it was a few years ago. It's been a little bit since I've been that way. There's a nesting colony there, and they're just hilarious when they're doing their courtship dances. If you get off of this and do nothing else, you can Google Western grebe courtship and just have yourself a good laugh at them because it's quite elaborate and quite fun to watch. Okay, shifting gears, we are going to cover the rails next, and rails are sort of chicken-like birds. The coot is very much duck-like in its habits compared to the other rails that we're going to cover. It's also very similar to the common gallinule, but we don't have those on the on the northern Great Plains up here. We just have the American coot. So if you're seeing something that's floating around, acting a fair bit like a duck, and it's jet black with a kind of pointy white bill and a little bit of white on its back tail feathers, that, my dear, is a coot. So jet black, bright white bill. It really stands out, that kind of contrast between completely dark body, bright white bill, and if you see, especially when they're displaying or they're fighting, they will fan out their tail feathers, and you can see on the undersides there's these little bits of white on those. So the American coot is fairly distinctive, and it makes kind of grunty sort of popping noises in the wetlands. So let's listen to the American coot here. So lots of just kind of, rough popping sort of sounds. That can be useful to hear, but usually you're going to be seeing them because they do hang out in wetlands, kind of in the open water area, acting very much like a duck. And rails, as you can see the sora here, they don't necessarily have webbed feet like a duck does. The American coot, however, does have lobes on its toes that help it swim around and paddle around like a duck. So it really is taking to that duck lifestyle as compared to the other rails that we'll cover. The Sora is one of the rails that you're likely to hear. It's also the one you have the best chance of seeing if you're in an area that you can be patient and there's some shallows for them to come out and forage in. But by and large, you're mostly going to be identifying these guys by sound. They're super territorial. If you drive up to a wetland on the side of the road and you slam your car door, just that slam can be enough to send them into whinnying and getting all vocal. So they're highly territorial little guys, and you'll often hear them, and they'll call into the daytime as well. Most species are, most active kind of that dawn and early morning hour. A lot of wetland birds are also very active at night. Sora is no different, but you can hear Sora during the day as well, just not as frequent. So let's listen to the whinnying call first here. So very kind of loud, raucous little call. And sometimes if you have a few in an area, you'll get them overlapping. And sometimes they truncate that whinny. It doesn't go on forever. And, sometimes you'll get one that will just keep that whinnying call going and going and going. So they can be a little variable in that way. The other really commonly heard call is the per-weep. Per-weep. So those are the calls of the Sora. If you do get to lay eyes on it, usually the thing that stands out, because they weave through vegetation and they're usually scurrying a fair bit, it's either that bright yellow bill contrasting with the black mask that just catches your eye, or if they have their tail up, those white tail feathers. Otherwise, they're kind of this slate blue gray with a lot of markings along the sides and the back. Again, for camouflage purposes, they want to be looking like the rest of the background. But they're pretty cute little birds, and one that's one of those secretive birds, but is easy to hear, which is always nice. Sometimes they're secretive and hard to hear, and that makes it a little bit more challenging. But that is the Sora, and they're very plentiful on the northern Great Plains in a lot of our wetlands. If you have a patch of cattails in a small wetland, there are good chances that you have a Sora hanging out in it. The other two rails that we're going to cover are very much going to be heard and barely seen. The yellow rail especially, they look like the rest of the vegetation, but they're also extremely nocturnal. So even hearing them, if you want to get out and have your best chances of hearing this bird, you want to be out kind of dusk or into the night. And even a moonless night is better than a night with a bright white full moon. So both very secretive. We'll listen to the yellow rail first, and it doesn't sound like a bird call at all. It sounds like you've taken two stones and are tapping them in a rhythmic tick 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 tone. And you can actually hear it a decent ways away. It's the kind of sound where if you didn't know anything about birds and you were walking by a wetland at night, you'd be scratching your head trying to figure out what on earth is making that noise, because it does not sound like any other bird that I've ever heard. It really has that kind of dry, just it does sound like tapping two stones together. So interesting strategy on their part in terms of a call. The other one is the Virginia rail. If you do get to see them, they have a drooping red bill and kind of a grayish face. And this is another one that is active at night and in the kind of late dusk and very, very early dawn. You can get into, getting to be 6 a.m. and most of the Virginia rails have stopped calling by then. They're really strongly nocturnal as well. Not quite as strongly nocturnal as the yellow rail, but they're getting pretty close. And the call that you're most likely to hear, it can be a little bit hard to detect, and it has a ticket quality to it. And it's one that, for whatever reason, my brain can tune it out very easily. And sometimes you can find that this happens, like your brain is just not grabbing on to those frequencies for whatever reason. So we'll play that ticket again because that was a short recording. Hear all of the spring peepers in the background of that track too. And they also do kind of a grunting call. I'll play that once more, that grunt. So those are two rather secretive rails. You can count yourself very fortunate if you actually get to lay eyes on either of these. More chances with the Virginia rail, the yellow rail. Yeah, good luck. They're really tough to actually lay eyes on. And just as an aside, some people keep track of a life list, and I had someone ask this the other day. One of my colleagues, he's like, "So if I heard a bird, do I get to count this for my life list?" And the cool thing about a life list is that it's your own life list, and you get to make those decisions. I think it's totally reasonable for some of these species. It's like, yeah, you are almost never going to see this bird. You were able to identify it and you knew what it was. For me, that counts as adding it to your life list. So if you ever hear somebody talk about a life list, and some people don't count sounds, but I think it is totally valid. And again, it is your list, your rules. You can do whatever you want. Okay, moving right along, we have two birds in kind of the heron family. We have two bitterns. They are both rather sneaky and more often heard than seen. The American bittern especially really relies on camouflage, and it will even point its bill straight up and sway in the wind if it feels like it's a little bit exposed and something's watching it. So something that's really much more likely to be heard than seen. And this pumperlunk call travels just such a distance away. Like you can hear it over a kilometer away on a, if there's no wind and it's kind of a cool morning, you can hear this pumperlunk a long, long ways off. And it's very unique sounding as well. So very interesting, very liquidy sounding call. And because it has a very low frequency sound waves, they're just able to travel longer distances before degrading than more higher frequency, higher pitched calls. So we'll play that once more because that pumperlunk is just such a neat sounding call. Okay. Next up is the least bittern, and these guys kind of just get into Manitoba. There's been, I think, two or three confirmed records in Saskatchewan, so this is definitely more of an eastern species that just starts to get into Manitoba. The least bittern is a very small heron-like bird. Rather secretive. I did surveys for least bitterns specifically for 2 summers, and I don't think I saw more than 10 at all. You'd mostly just catch them flying every now and again. I think that was the least bittern. So very, very sneaky little birds. Even if you're in an area looking for them, they are tough. So they make kind of a low coo 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 coo. This isn't a call that travels very far. So it's got to be kind of quiet and reasonably close to it. Definitely not like the American bittern that you're hearing a kilometer away. Let's listen to the coo coo cooing of the least bittern. To me, it almost sounds like kind of cartoon monkey sounds, like, that's what it sort of sounds like to me. We'll play it once more again for you. So very cute, tiny little heron-like bird. Next up, we've got the great blue heron and the white-faced ibis. Both of them are rather distinctive in their shape and coloration. Great blue herons, I think most people are familiar with. This is a very large heron with a long neck. In flight, they kind of tuck that neck up, so when you're seeing them flying, they don't have their neck pointed straight out. But overall, they kind of have this blue-grayish coloration to them. They have this really big kind of dark eyebrow stripe. At the height of the breeding season, they can have more wispies and little plumies on them, and they look very, very fancy in all of their breeding plumage. But they don't keep those necessarily all year round. So that's the great blue heron. They'll often be foraging a long ways away from their nesting colony. So they do tend to nest in colonies where they'll make stick nests up in trees, but you do get the odd singleton. I have seen in a few places just one lone great blue heron pair just out doing their own thing, but usually, they build nests in what you call a rookery, so there's multiple herons in one spot, but they do travel a really long distance to go forage, and they will eat anything that they can get their bills on. They're a fairly large bird, so they can consume fairly large critters. The white-faced ibis is an interesting one that is increasing on the Canadian prairies. It's been coming up from the States, seemed to get more of a foothold in Alberta first, and has been moving kind of eastward since. You'll get them a little bit in Manitoba. We're seeing them more and more frequently here in Saskatchewan as well. Very interesting look to them. They're very dark overall, especially if you're, seeing them at a distance and you can't catch that kind of dark maroon color to them. They just look very dark and they have a very long, kind of grayish, decurved bill that just, it's long, it's droopy, and they just look kind of funny looking. They're they're neat birds. If you catch them in the right light, they have some iridescence on their feathers, but long-legged. They're going to be hanging out in wetlands, and you'll often see these guys in groups. I've seen the odd singleton, but I did once see a group of 80 on the Saskatchewan-Alberta border, which was very, very cool. It's neat to see. They'll often just kind of walk in a group and poke and probe at stuff and forage. So neat bird, seeing more and more of them on the prairies. So if you're like, wow, that is a strange looking bird and I've been birding for a while, they're on the move. So you're likely to see more of them as the years progress, unless they stop for whatever reason. Sometimes bird expansions, they expand a little bit and then they kind of don't continue on. They kind of recede a little bit. Um, it's always interesting to see what birds do, and you know you'll always have ones that disperse after breeding and go, hey, this looks like maybe I'll come back to this next year kind of territory. This might not be so bad, and they do, and they're like, yeah, this was successful, and that's how some of that expansion happens. Okay, moving on to the shorebirds. First, we've got the Wilson snipe, and this is one that you're much more likely to hear than see. You'll see them occasionally perched up on a fence post like this, but they have a winnowing flight display, and this is a sound that's actually made by specialized tail feathers, and they go up, they fly way up, and they just go into a steep dive, and they fan those tail feathers out, and it's the wind rushing across those tail feathers that is making this winnowing flight display. So if you're hearing this, you're going to be, you're in a wetlandy sort of area, but it sounds like they're coming from all around you, and it's because they're flying around and making this noise. So they are really traveling a fair bit. So let's listen to that winnowing flight display. So super cool that that's not actually a vocalization. That is a physical sound that they're making. They do have other vocalizations, and this one always reminds me of a squeaky wheel, kind of like, for whatever reason, I just envisioned like a little clown on a tiny tricycle making a squeaky wheel sort of noise. So that's the squeaky wheel kecking. You don't hear that quite as much as you hear the winnowing flight display, and I'll just play that one more time for you. So pretty neat physical little sound. Oop, sorry, just getting a phone call. Next up, we have the killdeer, and this is a bird that is very vocal and is definitely not shy about letting you know that you are in its midst. This is a plover, and they have kind of a pigeon-shaped little head with a stubby little bill on it. And if you look head on, they have two dark rings around their neck. They also have some dark bands across their forehead and across their bill, but really it's those two complete rings around kind of that breast area on them. They're plain brown above, and I'm sure if you've ever seen this, you'll remember it. They do a broken wing display to lead you away from their nest or their young, because they nest out in some gravel, or in a field. They don't really make much of a nest at all. They'll scrape the ground and then they'll lay their eggs in that. So the eggs and even their young, especially in the very early stages of life, and the eggs as well, they're very, very camouflaged. So they're relying on that. And the parent is pretending to be an injured bird, say, oh, hey, easy meal over here. And they will lead you away from their nest and from their eggs. So neat little behavior. And it's one of those birds that says its name, and they do loud variations of killdeer, killdeer. And they'll just keep going and going and going if you're hanging out in their territory. So this is definitely one that you can get good practice on seeing visually and hearing its call, because it is going to make sure that you hear it. Next up, we have three other species of shorebirds that we're mostly going to focus on the visuals for here. We got the Wilson's phalarope, the American avocet, and the black-necked stilt. These guys all have kind of longish, pointed bills. The Wilson's phalarope really has a very, very needle-like bill. It is very fine, very dainty. They have a dark eyeline that extends back and goes down the side of the neck, and an orangey wash on the throat. Um, the females are the dominant ones in this species, and they're the ones that are boldly colored. They're going to be displaying, and it's the males that are more subdued. So it's very much like a more toned down version of the female here on this slide. So interesting little breeding dynamic there. And they have very interesting flight. They kind of flit around like a butterfly. They have a very buoyant and erratic flight. So if you're seeing that along with that very fine pointed little bill, you know you're in the phalarope territory. And during the breeding season here, we have the Wilson's phalarope. There's a few migrant species that we'll see in the spring and in the fall, but during the breeding season, we have the Wilson's phalarope. They make kind of a woof woofing call, but you don't always hear it a ton. You'll often see them out floating on the water, and what they'll do is they'll spin in tight little circles. They'll use their feet to churn up the water and make a little vortex, and that kind of does makes a little upwelling of all sorts of little tiny goodies, so like little phytoplankton and zooplankton and small copepods and things like that. So they're stirring up the water to get at some of those tasty little food bits. The American avocet is a really iconic prairie species, very bold black and white body with that kind of just salmon cinnamony wash down the head and the neck. They have a very long bill that is slightly upturned, and in the females, it is more upturned than the males. So if you see two side by side, that can be a good, you know, check to see like, oh yeah, that one's that one's really turned over to the side. That one must be the female. They have kind of bluish legs, but you know, they're very, very common on shallow wetlands across the prairies, and that kind of bold black and white patterning is really helpful. It really draws your eye to it, and then you've got that salmon wash down the head with that kind of upturned bill. Blackneck stilt is another one similar to the white-faced ibis that is increasing its foothold in Canada on the prairies. It was another one that you would see more in Alberta for a bit, but they've started marching into Saskatchewan, and they're kind of at about the Saskatoon um, range. I'm sure as you know the next decade or two go on that we'll see more and more of them in kind of eastern parts of the province, but for now you're more likely to see them kind of Saskatoon westward. Blackneck stilts are just they're very, very dainty. They look like their legs could just snap in a stiff breeze. They have long bubblegum pink legs, and otherwise they're just very black and white, black above, whitish below, with a little white eyebrow, and a very, very fine, pointy black bill. They just look absolutely impossibly dainty. I'm always amazed at how something can get around on legs that are that long and that skinny. That just seems so risky to me. And they're funny to see when they kind of nestle down on their nest because they have those long legs to contend with. It's just yeah, there's a lot of leg there in the blackneck stilt. So some pretty iconic breeding shorebirds here. We have two more that look similar. They're both kind of similar to the dabbling ducks. They have this kind of mottled brownish or grayish coloration to them. The willet is much more grayish overall. The godwit has more warm brownish tones, especially if it shows you the wings. So what I look for, we're looking at the body color here. It's like, okay, very, very grayish, maybe a little bit warmish. And then I look at the bill. They both have relatively long bills, but in the willet, it is gray and it is straight. On the marbled godwit, it is a fair bit longer and it's two-toned. So it's orange closer to the body and it kind of fades into a darker tip. So overall, the whole thing for the willet just looks very, very gray. The legs are gray, the bill is gray, the body color is very, very gray. Just really reads gray overall. until it flaps its wings. And then it shows on the tips of the wings here very bold black and white coloration. And I was really excited a couple of weeks ago at Chaplin Lake because I was just kind of standing there and I saw my first willet fly by. And it's just, I'm always shocked at how striking that black and white patterning is on their wings. You wouldn't know it based on them, walking around and looking all boring gray, but as soon as they open those wings, that black and white coloration really, really stands out. The marbled godwit has much more cinnamon warm tones in its wings. So, if you're confused between the two and you're not sure about the bill, if you get to see them fly, you're going to be looking for that bold black and white coloration. They're also very loud birds, especially during the breeding season. If you're anywhere near their territory, they will let you know about it and they will follow you. I've had them follow me to 2 or 3 ponds on a morning of survey. So willets do a couple of different calls. There's some more elaborate pill will willet and other kind of shorter willet calls. Let's do the willet one first here. I think it's this one. Oops. I put them too close together. And that's something that mostly just gets your attention and gets you looking in that direction. The pill will willet is easier to learn and identify down to species based on call. So let's listen to that pill will willet call. And they just keep going and going and going if you are in their territory. Let's listen to that willet call, or the pill will willet once more. Much the same, the godwit does a little bit of the name saying and says, Godwit, Godwit. And it definitely has a more raspy quality to it. Again, sort of sounds a little bit deranged and bedraggled. So let's listen to that godwit call again. So those are the willets and the godwit. I'm going to add in this quick little bonus species here because you often see them on migration and they're often, you know, they can be late coming through and they can hang around for a while. And they're also one of the first um, shorebirds to come back during the fall migration, and they can start coming back in July. So we see them often in a number of wetland and lake systems, and they're both called yellowlegs. One is the lesser yellowlegs, the other is the greater yellowlegs. And if you're going, my goodness, those look like the same bird species. Yes, they are very similar to one another. They can be tough to tell apart. Both of them streaky, brownish looking with bright, shocking yellow legs. And the thing to pay attention that I find is most reliable is taking a look at the length of the head and comparing it to the length of the bill. In the lesser, the length of that head from kind of the base of the bill to the back of the head is about the same length as the bill is. So kind of a 1-to-1 ratio. Versus the greater yellow legs has a longer bill, so that length between the base of the bill and the back of the head, it doesn't quite account for all of that bill length. So that's one of the better ways to tell those two apart. If you have the two species side by side, then the size difference is quite evident. But again, when you were looking at things and trying to determine size at a distance, it's really, really tough. I would not be estimating based on size unless I had the two of them kind of side by side, or I knew I had a lesser yellowlegs next to a much larger shorebird or one that was similar in size to the greater yellowlegs. But focus as you're learning these two on kind of that relative length of the bill length to the head length, and that is going to be helpful. If they're facing away from you, that bill looks shorter, so it's not perfect at every angle. You need to get kind of a side eye or a side on view of them for that to work, but That is the best tip I can give you for those species. There is a little bit less barring on the flanks of the lesser compared to the greater, but I don't find that to be a terribly useful clue. I like that bill size much, much better. And a little bit of birding humor for you. This is from the Field Guide to the Little Known and Seldom Seen Birds of North America, which is a joke field guide. And this is just poking fun at just sometimes you're pulling your hair out trying to figure out, is this a greater yellow legs, a lesser yellow legs, maybe it's a middle yellow legs, a slightly lesser yellow legs, a very least yellow legs. So that's just kind of poking fun at, yes, they all look extremely similar and the size differences can, be confounding a little bit. So I always find that one kind of funny. Okay. Next up, we have three species of terns. Terns are like the sleeker, sexier cousins of the gulls. They have pointier wings. They tend to have nice little pointed bills. The black tern is really, really easy to tell from all the other terns. It has a jet black body and silvery wings and tail feathers. It is just a gorgeous bird. It looks amazing. I love them. They'll often forage a great distance away from their breeding colonies, and so sometimes you'll be out on a wetland and suddenly you're like, "Oh, you're doing your thing," and all of a sudden there are black terns around you, and a couple of minutes later there are no black terns to be seen. So they do move a fair distance when they're foraging, and they don't dive into the water like the common and forester's tern do. These guys gently kind of pick stuff off the surface of the water. So very different foraging strategy than the other two terns. So black tern, nice and easy to identify. The two other terns, however, are very, very similar, and you don't always get a good enough look to differentiate the two species. So if you are just getting to turn, you're like, it's common or foresters. I have both in my area. I'm not sure. That is totally okay because I have seen countless, I've probably seen more terns that I couldn't identify down to species than I have been able to identify them. And that's just to say that because they're fast moving, they can also travel a fair distance. So it just comes in for a swoop and you don't get the look you need. So it's okay to just let those things go. Not everything can be identified. For me, the easiest way to identify them is if you happen to see them perched on something, which is not how I often see them, but if you are fortunate enough, you can tell by a couple of ways. So the common tern, the wingtips are darker and they look very dark when the wingtips are folded. So those wingtips, those pointy bits of the wings, once they're folded, they are darker and that contrasts with the rest of the body. So darker look to them, definitely contrasting, whereas the forester's tern has silvery gray primary feathers, those little wingtips, and it just kind of blends in with the rest of the wing and body color. And that's when those wings are tucked up and folded. If you're going to get super nerdy and you're like, I'm not sure about that those colorations on the folded feathers there, you can also take a look at the difference in length relative to the tail feathers. So the common tern, the tail feathers are shorter than the folded wingtips. So when they fold their wingtips out, those wingtips hang off the back of them and their tail feathers are held down here. The forester's tern has longer tail feathers than its primary. So when it tucks its wings up, those feathers are hanging down off the bottom. Those are the tail feathers. So those are two ways to tell them apart when they are perched. However, we mostly see these guys as they're flying, and the best thing I have come up with is looking at the color of their back in relation to the rest of the wing. In the common tern, the rest of the coloration on the wing, and they can have some black wedges, and sometimes they don't have them depending on the plumage. But that the color of the upper back, which is usually called the mantle in gulls and terns, is the same coloration as most of the wing. So common is continuous. And Forester's terns, that back is a darker gray than the wingtip. So the Forester fades. And if you can just remember those, or even just know that that's what you're looking for, you can then go to your field guys like, okay, which one has whiter wing feathers than the dark feathers on their back? Then you can tell those two apart maybe a little bit easier. There are slight differences in the coloration of the bellies. And what I don't like about using the slightly gray belly of the common tern is that the shadow, depending on the lighting, makes it look gray anyway. So you can have a forester's tern that has a shadow on its belly, and that makes it just look like it has a gray belly. So that's not something I use. Um, the bill color is also a little bit more reddish on the common and a little bit more orangish on the forester's tern. But you get any sort of warm lighting conditions, and that can be really tough to tell apart. Something like that is useful if you have like a mixed flock and they're perched somewhere, and then you can really compare between two individuals where you're going, oh, is this like red enough or is it orangey enough? It's much easier to do if you have them side by side. So those can be other clues, but they aren't the ones that I necessarily rely on. I'm looking at the back coloration in relation to the rest of the wing, excluding any kind of dark wedges and stuff. We're looking at kind of that overall wing coloration of the kind of gray whitish. So fades in the foresters goes from dark gray to very pale silvery gray. And the common is just the same continuous coloration all along the back. So those are my tricks for those two. I need to take a sip of water. 'Cause holy smokes, this is a lot of talking. Okay, next up we have two very similar species of wrens. We have the marsh wren and the sedge wren, and they are both very, very small, and they're very, very active, and they sing all the time. They're very, very active little singers, and because they're so brown and they're so small, it is much easier to identify them by sound. If you do get a good look, the marsh wren has a contrasting white eyebrow and a plain patch on the upper wing here, and the sedge wren kind of just lacks those features, doesn't have a distinct white eyebrow, and is just kind of patterned overall on the wing. There's no kind of patch where there isn't any patterning. The marsh wren has kind of a gurgling rattle, which kind of sounds like a tape on fast forward or Alvin the Chipmunk, as some folks were kind enough to remind me last time. So let's listen to that gurgling rattle of the marsh wren. And we can compare that to the much more mechanical rattle of the sedge wren. The sedge wren starts off with usually three introductory notes and then a kind of harsh rattle. It's not musical and it doesn't vary in between bouts of singing. It's just kind of always the same thing repeated. So gurgling rattle, harsher sewing machine. Let's listen again to that gurgling rattle of the marsh wren. Kind of squeaky a little bit, very, very jumbly, and you can tell that they're kind of varying phrases in between repeats, whereas a sedge wren is very much the same thing over and over. Those few introductory notes and those very kind of distinct rattle calls. So much more easy to get an identification based on the calls, because even if you do see them, you don't see them for very long, or they're far enough away for you to say, ah, I can tell it's a wren because it's doing this weird thing with its tail. It's always sticking it up and it doesn't stop singing. But oftentimes you don't get a very long look at them. We also have two very close look-alike sparrows. We have the LeConte sparrow and the Nelson's sparrow. And the LeConte sparrow sounds very much like an insect. It's got a harsher call, and it goes ticka-ch. Whereas the pardon me, hang on a second. Ooh, okay, sorry about that. That's what you get for talking for almost 2 hours. Okay. So the Nelson sparrow has much more of an ephemeral, quiet call. It sounds kind of like bacon sizzling, kind of sounds like tequila. and they kind of have that pacing. They don't call rapidly, one after the other. They kind of have several seconds in between each of their calls. The Lacan sparrow can call a little bit more frequently. So again, kind of insect-like and more harsh. Versus that quiet, ephemeral tequila sound. And this is a call that really, really, really doesn't travel very far at all. And you can imagine if you're in a noisy wetland that you've got marsh wrens going and blackbirds singing, that it's very, very easy to overlook this very quiet Nelson sparrow. They're another species that will sing throughout the night, and a lot of the blackbirds will just be quiet at those hours. So it's one that you can sometimes have a better chance of hearing just because there's less going on in the rest of the soundscape sometimes, depending on the composition of your wetland. We're getting close, folks. We're almost there. So we have three blackbirds here, and two of them are very aptly named. We have the red-winged blackbird and the yellow-headed blackbird. So for the males, there is no misidentifying those species. Even if you were to say, like, hey, kid, give that bird a name, they're like, oh, you come up with something similar to red-winged blackbird, I think. So let's listen to the conqueree call of the red-winged blackbird. And they'll often, fan their tail feathers out, spread their wings out, and they will puff up these red little shoulder patches. So they're trying to display, they're like, yes, yes, this is my territory. Ladies, you are in Bob's wonderful territory. Look at all of the things I can provide for you. So let's listen to that conqueree again. And this is probably a song that you're very familiar with, even if you don't really realize it. If you've been close to water that has any sort of shrub, there's usually red-winged blackbirds. Sometimes I've seen them nest in places where there's no cattails or anything, and it's more like shoreline with some scrubbiness, but they'll very much at home in like big cattail wetlands. They also have an alarm call that is very kind of high-pitched and easy to hear. So if you hear this, this is also the red-winged blackbird. You can have it can be really, really loud. I actually turned the volume down on it because in this one track it was so loud. So here's that C again. The yellow-headed blackbird has a kind of hilarious call that kind of starts with some intro notes. Wah, 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 wah. And it just, if you see the spectrogram, it covers the whole spectrogram. It's kind of ridiculous. And they throw their head backs while they do that kind of wailing snarl at the end. So very wonderful. These guys nest kind of in deeper cattail marshes for the most part. So you won't see them in quite as many places as red-winged blackbirds, but yellow-headed blackbirds are kind of loosely colonial. So if you see one, you're definitely going to be seeing some more. So here is their song. So you can imagine if you've got a wetland and it's dawn and the full chorus is on, you have a pile of red-winged blackbirds and you have a pile of yellow-headed blackbirds, it could be really tough to mentally catalog that and try to hear anything else that's going on because boy, do they like to sing and call. The bobolink is a fairly distinctive blackbird as well. They don't hang out in deeper wetlands so much as they like kind of wet meadow areas, so those kind of very ephemeral wetlands. The back of their head is this pale kind of straw color, and otherwise they're a black and white blackbird. But the best thing about them is their R2D2 noises and calls. Super, super lovely. What's a long one? really hilarious, totally sounds like a robot, does not sound like it should be a bird making that noise. If you happen to be in Regina, we went 2 years ago to the McKell Conservation Area for one of the marsh walks, and I'll probably go back to that one again this year because it's a nice place to get bobolinks, but you'll have some chance of encountering bobolinks at that spot. So let's listen to that once more. It's just so wonderful. I love it. Okay. The females of these species can be a little bit trickier. The easiest one of the gang is the yellow-headed blackbird because she looks very similar to the way the male looks. Instead of black, she's kind of this deep brown coloration, and she has a bit of that yellow on her throat, chest, and kind of facial area. So not nearly as extensive as the male, but when you see her, you're like, oh, that makes sense. Yes, I could see those being the same species. The red-winged blackbird, however, looks nothing like the male. This is a overall brown, streaky bird. All blackbirds have kind of a conical pointed bill in common, and you can see that here. It's like this is pointier than a sparrow's bill would be. A sparrow tends to have a kind of slightly rounded upper bill, like culmen there. So these guys have much more of a cone-shaped pointy bill. She's got a white eyebrow streak, dark bill, and some of the older females will start to get a little bit of reddish on those shoulder patches there. But otherwise, take a look, listen for the males, and then you can see the females. They're going to be bouncy through the wetland, going around, gathering food, and they'll just be kind of brown and streaky and less obvious. The males of both the blackbirds, well, actually all three of them, they like to perch in really obvious locations and just sing their little hearts out. All of the females tend to be way more secretive because, again, they don't want to be attracting too much attention. The bobolink female is very yellowy straw colored overall. She's got a dark eye line that kind of extends behind the eye, a pinkish little bill, and otherwise is just kind of very, very pale looking. You don't see a ton of the females. They tend to be a little bit sneaky, and in part also because there tends to be less bobolink on the landscape. There's a lot of red-winged blackbirds, and there can be a lot of yellow-headed blackbirds, which just leads you to see more of the females, whereas the bobolink females, they're just sneaky. They don't like to hang out in the open, so you can see them, but not nearly as often as you see those kind of striking displaying males. Okay, we have one harrier or one raptor that we're covering because the northern harrier really does like to nest in wetlands and it likes to hunt in fields and cruise low over wetlands. They fly, and somebody reminded me of this last time, they fly at a bit of a dihedral, meaning they hold their wings up. They don't hold them kind of flat out beside themselves so much as a little bit upwards. And the thing that the two sexes have in common is this bright white rump patch. Their tail is kind of longish, and you can see right between the tail and the upper back, there's this big white patch. And because of the way they forage, they just kind of cruise low over the landscape, you actually get a pretty good look at their back. Because most raptors, you're going, oh, thanks, Leanne, you're telling me to look at the top of the hawk that I'm seeing from below. The harrier is a little bit of an exception to that because they forage so low on the landscape that you do actually get to see the backside or the upper portions of them. You don't just see them from below. The males overall are kind of blue-gray, and the females and juveniles are more streaky and warm brown colorations. They have a facial disc much like an owl does, and yeah, they're just neat neat little birds that you can usually just identify them by the way they're flying, low, kind of cruising over the landscape, tipping over and below hills, and it's kind of they're just neat to watch forage. I quite like harriers. Okay, and we're gonna finish up with the common yellowthroat. I think I'm going to skip the amphibians for tonight and we'll move the amphibians to next week because my voice is just about done. So we'll cover off on our last bird, the common yellowthroat. The males have a handsome little black bandit mask with a white edge, and they do have that quite yellowish throat. They make themselves seen much, much more than the females, who are more olivey colored, but they do have a little bit of that yellow. They're just tough to see. It is tough to find good photographs of them, and that usually gives you a clue as to whether or not they're easily spotted. So tough to see these guys. They do have a little bit of a white eye ring, and that yellowish throat, it can look a little bit whitish, but there is definitely a contrast between the white throat and the rest of the face coloration. Plain face other than that little eye ring. And the males sing this kind of witchetty, witchetty, witchetty call, and little variations on that theme. Let's listen to that now. So little variations on witchetty, witchetty, witch. Let's listen to it once more. And much like other warblers, if you have any experience with them, they are small, they are active, and they can be a little bit sneaky. They have these little pointed bills, which are really great for just plucking insects off of vegetation. Okay, we are going to skip the frogs for this evening because I don't think that I could keep talking for another little bit here. We'll talk about this next week too. If you want to get out, this is a great time of year to get out and try your hand at collecting a little bit of data, a little bit of information. You can register for MarshWatch on Nature Counts. You can get the app. It's actually a really easy way to collect and enter data. It saves you from having to write it all down in a notebook and then remember to go back to your computer and find the location and then submit it. This just removes that entire other barrier to reporting stuff. So, you don't need to submit a complete checklist. There's an option to say this is an incomplete checklist, and that lets us know that you're still learning. You're not maybe like identifying everything that you saw. Maybe you had trouble with some of the ducks, so you can consider those almost like a practice checklist if you want to hit that not submitting a complete checklist. So don't worry about that. This is kind of more of an exercise to get you used to data submission. You can share these checklists with eBird if you do eBird, and um, I forgot to check this, and I will make sure to do it for next week. But I think you can import your eBird checklists into this program on Nature Counts. You can for others like breeding bird atlases, but I don't know if we have that enabled for this one. So I'll get an answer for you for that next week. And holy man, thank you guys for hanging in there. This was a long one. Here's my contact info. You can reach Birds Canada on all the socials. A huge shout out to our supporters who make this kind of programming possible. For this program, that's the Manitoba Habitat Conservancy, the Government of Canada, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, SaskPower, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. Thank you guys so much for bearing with me through this really long webinar. Yeah, I am, my voice is it's just about toast, so I think we did pretty good. Sometimes I need to go on less tangents if we're going to cover this more, but I get excited about birds. You probably realize this. So I like sharing that sorts of stuff. So thank you guys so much. I will post this online, especially for those who had to take off early. I think about half the people wound up leaving, which is, like I said, is totally fine because it's a long one. If you're anywhere further east of here, it's getting fairly late for a Wednesday night. So thank you guys for bearing with. We'll cover the frogs next week for our final webinar. I can't believe we're already at the last one. So thank you all so much. It's always a pleasure to do this, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. I hope you get to go outside and do some birding. Maybe it won't be crazy windy where you are. It's supposed to be very, very windy the next few days across almost the entirety of Saskatchewan. So yeah, don't think I'll be doing a ton of birding this weekend, but yeah, it'll be fun. And regardless of what I wind up doing. Okay. I'm actually losing my voice now. Thank you guys so much, and I will see you all again next week. Bye bye.